In 1845, Thomas, an enslaved man on a Maryland plantation, uses his secretly acquired literacy and photographic memory to document the brutalities of slavery, orchestrating his escape through the Underground Railroad to not only achieve freedom, but to publish a narrative that would become a weapon in the fight for abolition. My name is Thomas, but that is not the name I was born with. The name I was given by my mother was a whisper, a piece of a song from a land I'd never seen, a name that tasted of sunlight and open plains. That name was buried the day I was first sold, buried under the weight of a bill of sale that listed me as chattel, no different from a mule or a bale of cotton. The name they gave me, Thomas, was simple, easy for a master to shout across a field. For 20 years, it was the only name I answered to. This story begins not with my birth, but with my awakening, and my awakening began with the sound of a bell. Before the sun even thought of bleeding light over the Chesapeake Bay, the bell would ring. It was a sharp, brutal sound that cleaved the quiet air, a sound that meant your time was no longer your own. It belonged to Master Edward Lloyd and his sprawling plantation in Talbot County, Maryland. Our world was one of tobacco and wheat, a relentless cycle of planting, tending, and harvesting under a sun that showed no mercy. My days were spent in the fields, my back a constant dull ache, my hands calloused and split from the coarse leaves of the tobacco plant. I remember the smells of that life more than anything. The sweet, sickly scent of curing tobacco in the barns, the damp, earthy smell of the dirt floor in our cabin, the metallic tang of fear that always hung in the air, thick as the summer humidity. Our cabin was small, shared with my mother, Mama Ilara, and 2 other families. There was no privacy, no real comfort, just a place to collapse after the last bell rang, a place to steal a few hours of sleep before the first bell stole them back. My mother was the keeper of our history, the quiet guardian of our humanity. In the slivers of darkness between the end of work and the exhaustion that claimed us, she would tell me stories, not stories of this place, but of her grandmother, who remembered the ocean crossing. She would hum songs, her voice low and rich, melodies that didn't belong in a Maryland field. The rhythms were complex, the words a mix of English and a language she called her own. The overseer, a man named Finch, with eyes as pale and cold as a winter sky, called it devil's noise. To me, it was the only real thing in a world of lies. "They can own your back, Thomas," she'd whisper, her hand tracing the lines on my palm. "They can own your hands, but they can't own what's in here." She'd tap my head. "And in here," she'd press her hand to my chest. "This is yours. This is God's. You keep it safe." That was the world I knew. A world of hard labor, small kindnesses, and a simmering, silent fear. I understood the rules. Work hard, stay quiet, never look a white man directly in the eye for too long. Breaking the rules meant meeting Finch and his whip, a leather serpent he called the Corrector. I had seen what it did. I had seen a man's back laid open for working too slow, a woman's cries muffled for dropping a tool. The whip was the master's pen, and it wrote its lessons in our flesh. The journey, do chicote ao livro, from the whip to the book, seemed not just impossible but unimaginable. My awakening came on a Tuesday. I remember because it was market day. A speculator had come from Baltimore, a man with a ledger and a greedy smile. We were all lined up in the yard, stripped to the waist, men and women. He walked the line, pinching our arms, checking our teeth like we were horses. His eyes landed on a young boy named Samuel, no more than 10 years old. Samuel was my friend. We'd sneak scraps for the dogs together. He taught me how to carve a whistle from a reed. His mother, Sarah, stood beside him, trembling. When the speculator pointed at Samuel and nodded to Master Lloyd, a sound tore from Sarah's throat that was not human. It was the sound of a soul being ripped in two. She clung to her boy, and Finch moved in. He didn't use the whip. He used his fists. He tore the boy from her arms and shoved him toward the speculator's wagon. I stood there, frozen. I watched Samuel's face, small and terrified, disappear into the back of the wagon. I watched Sarah collapse into the dust, her wails echoing off the great house. And in that moment, something inside me broke. It wasn't the injustice of it. I had always known this world was unjust. It was the record of it. The speculator made a note in his little book. Master Lloyd made a note in his. Samuel was gone, and the only proof he had ever been there was a mother's broken heart and a line of ink in a ledger. That night, I couldn't sleep. The image of the ledger burned behind my eyes. Their book held the power of life and death. Their words could erase a boy, shatter a family. My mother's words came back to me. They can't own what's in here. I crept out of the cabin. The moon was high, casting long shadows. I went to the side of the master's workshop, where I'd seen the carpenters draw plans on discarded planks. I found a piece of charcoal, its blackness a comfort in my hand. On the rough wood of the wall, shielded by a large oak tree, I tried to copy the one letter I knew for certain, the L from the brand on the Lloyd estate barrels. It was clumsy, a crooked imitation, but it was mine. It was a mark, a secret. I wasn't just a body to be worked and broken. I was a mind. And my mind would be my weapon. The idea, then just a flicker, was born. What if an escravo escrive bestseller, a slave writes a bestseller? What if I could write our story, not with the master's ink, but with our own truth? I didn't know how. I didn't know the words, but I knew I had to learn. I knew I had to find a way to make our lives, our sorrows, our very existence mean more than a line in a white man's book. That night, under the Maryland moon, I made a vow. I would learn. I would learn to read and write. I would learn to steal their most powerful tool and turn it against them. The first step on my path from the whip to the word had been taken, not with a grand declaration, but with a single shaky letter drawn in charcoal, a silent act of war against a world that sought to keep me silent. My own education would begin as I would apprendre comme guise no chon, learn to read with chalk on the ground, or with whatever tool I could find. The desire to read became a fire in my belly, a hunger that no amount of cornmeal and salted pork could satisfy. It was a dangerous hunger. In the state of Maryland, as in all the South, an educated slave was seen as a spark in a powder keg. The laws were clear. Teaching a person of color to read or write was a crime. For us, learning was an act of rebellion punishable by the lash, or worse. But the image of Samuel's name being written in that ledger, his life reduced to an accounting entry, was a greater terror. My first classroom was the world around me. My first teacher was desperation. I started with the brands on the tools, the initials on the grain sacks. I would trace them in the dirt with a stick, whispering their shapes until they were burned into my memory. Master Lloyd's young son, a boy of 8 named Daniel, would sometimes have his lessons on the veranda with his tutor. I would find reasons to be nearby, mending a fence or weeding the garden beds, my ears straining to catch the sounds. A is for apple, B is for boy. I was the boy, but the apple was as far from my reach as the moon. The real breakthrough came from an old man we called Father Abraham. He was the plantation's blacksmith, his massive arms corded with muscle, his face a roadmap of wrinkles. He had been born in Virginia and had learned, through some miracle of cunning and luck, to read the Bible. He saw the hunger in my eyes. One evening, as I brought him a broken hoe to mend, he saw me staring at a discarded newspaper he used to wrap his lunch. He looked around, his eyes scanning the twilight. "Them marks talk, you know," he rumbled, his voice low like the coals in his forge. "They tell stories. You want to learn their language?" I could only nod, my throat tight. Our lessons were held in secret in the dead of night, in the back of the sweltering smithy. There was no paper, no ink. My first slate was the packed dirt floor of the forge. This is how I truly began to apprendre lire comme guise no chaume. Learn to read with chalk on the ground. Father Abraham would use a piece of limestone to scratch out the letters, his huge calloused finger guiding my own. "This here's an S," he'd say. "Looks like a snake, and it can be just as dangerous if the wrong folk see you know it." We started with the Bible. He had a tattered copy, its pages soft as cloth, that he kept hidden in a loose brick in the forge wall. He taught me the sounds letters made, how they strung together to form words, how words built sentences, how sentences built worlds. "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." Those words hit me with the force of a physical blow. The power was not in the whip, or the bell, or the master's ledger. The power was in the Word, and I could learn it. I could wield it. My progress was slow, painstaking, but my mind, starved for so long, devoured everything. I began to see words everywhere, on patent medicine bottles in the great house trash, on notices nailed to the church door, on the spines of books in the master's library, glimpsed through a window I was cleaning. Every word was a victory. Every sentence was a secret map. It was in a crumpled copy of the Baltimore Sun that I first read the words Underground Railroad. It was an article written by a furious slave owner decrying the network of lawless abolitionists who were stealing his property. He described it as a secret chain of houses, barns, and hidden cellars stretching from the south all the way to the north, to a place called Canada, where the Queen's law meant a man was free. He wrote of conductors who guided the passengers by night, following a star, a star. That night I looked up at the sky as I had 1,000 times before, but now I saw it differently. Mama Ilara used to sing a song Finch hated more than any other. She said it was a song to help you work, but the way she'd look up at the sky when she sang it, when the sun comes back and the first quail calls, "Follow the drinking gourd." For the old man is waiting for to carry you to freedom, if you follow the drinking gourd. Father Abraham explained it to me. The drinking gourd was the Big Dipper. The 2 stars on the edge of its cup always pointed to the North Star, the star that never moved, the star that led to freedom. The song wasn't just a song, it was a map, a code. Our music, our stories, our faith, they were all part of a secret language of resistance. This knowledge changed me. The slow ache in my back felt different. It was no longer the ache of submission, but the ache of a coiled spring. I began my own quiet acts of resistance. When Finch ordered us to clear a new field, I would accidentally strike the roots of a shade tree with my axe just enough to weaken it, so the next storm might bring it down. When a piece of equipment broke, my repairs might be just a little less sturdy than they should be, ensuring it would break again. It was a small, petty war, but it was mine. I started building alliances. I identified those who carried the same fire in their eyes, the ones who listened to my mother's songs with a different kind of attention. A woman named Esther, who worked in the kitchen and could move through the great house almost unseen. A man named Isaac, who was a driver, but whose heart was with us, and who knew the patrol schedules better than Finch himself. We didn't speak of escape. Not yet. We spoke in codes, in shared glances, in the hum of a spiritual. We were testing the ground, building a foundation of trust. My special skill became my memory. Fueled by my new literacy, I became an observer, a secret chronicler. I memorized the layout of the plantation, the creeks and marshes that bordered it, the schedules of the patrols. I began to piece together a map in my head, a map made of overheard conversations, landmarks from the Drinking Gourd song, and the slivers of information from the master's newspapers. The dream of an escravo, escrive bestseller, a slave writes a bestseller, was evolving. It was no longer a distant fantasy. It was a mission. If I could escape, I wouldn't just be saving myself. I would carry all of them with me, Samuel, Sarah, Father Abraham, my mother, in the words I would write. My book would be their testament. My freedom would be their vengeance. The journey, do chicote ao livro, from the whip to the book, was no longer just about learning to read. It was about learning to be free. And freedom, I was beginning to understand, was not something given. It was something taken. The year is 1848. 3 years have passed since I first traced that L on the workshop wall. Now I could read a newspaper from front to back, though I had to do it in stolen glances, the paper hidden in a barrel or beneath a floorboard. My mind was no longer a prison, it was an arsenal. The map of my escape was no longer a vague notion. It was taking shape, a ghost image overlaid on the physical world. My planning was meticulous, a secret architecture built in the silent hours of the night. It began with the land. Talbot County is a place of water, a finger-like peninsula carved by the Chesapeake and its many rivers. Water could be a barrier, but it could also be a road. I learned the tides of the Choptank River, the way the currents moved, the phases of the moon that brought the highest tides and the darkest nights. I paced out distances, counting my steps between the edge of the cotton fields and the relative safety of the dense woods, memorizing the feel of the land under my feet so I could run it blind. My literacy was my primary tool. In a discarded almanac, I found tables of sunrise and sunset, of moon phases for the entire year. This was gold. It allowed me to predict the nights of deepest darkness, the best times to move unseen. From scraps of the abolitionist Intelligencer found used as wrapping for goods from Baltimore, I learned the names of towns in Pennsylvania and Delaware, Wilmington, Philadelphia. These names became sacred, whispered like prayers. They were points on a celestial map, destinations I had to reach. The next layer of my plan was people. My small alliance had grown. There was Esther from the kitchen, whose silence was a cloak. She would listen to the master and his guests talk, memorizing names of abolitionist sympathizers they cursed, towns where fugitives had been caught. She was my ears inside the great house. There was Isaac, the driver. He hated his role, the way he was forced to be an extension of the master's will. His atonement was information. He knew the patrol routes, knew which patrollers were lazy, which were drunkards, and which were dangerously sharp. He would leave signals for me. A stone placed on a particular fence post meant a clear path. 2 stones meant a patrol was near. And there was Father Abraham. He was my link to the world beyond. He had connections, whispers he'd heard from traveling blacksmiths and free black sailors at the docks. He knew of a Quaker community in Delaware, a few days' journey away, who were said to be a station on the Underground Railroad. He gave me my target. "They are people of God, Thomas," he said, his voice a low growl, "but do not mistake their kindness for foolishness. You must prove yourself worthy of their trust. You must arrive alone, and you must come with the code." The code. A friend of a friend. A simple phrase, but it was the key to a hidden kingdom. The preparations were agonizingly slow. Survival depended on what I could carry and what I could find. For months, Esther would skim a little extra from the kitchen, a handful of dried corn, a piece of salted fish, and hide it for me. I fashioned a small waterproof pouch from a piece of pig's bladder, a disgusting but necessary task. Inside, I would keep my most precious possession, a small, crudely made book. I'd stitched it together from scraps of paper and a stolen piece of leather. In it, using a nub of a pencil I'd found, I was writing. I was documenting everything. The names of families torn apart, the number of lashes for minor infractions, the daily humiliations, the dream of the Escravo Escrive bestseller. Slave Writes a Bestseller was taking physical form. This book was my proof. It was my reason. If I was caught, it would be my death sentence. If I escaped, it would be my testimony. I studied the patterns of vigilance with an obsessive focus. Finch, the overseer, was predictable. He was thorough in the evenings, but after his nightly ration of whiskey, he grew sloppy. The dogs were the real threat. I spent weeks observing them, learning their barks, their territories. I started saving scraps of meat, throwing them to the dogs when Finch wasn't looking, not to make them my friends, but to make my scent familiar, less of an alarm. But with every piece of the plan that clicked into place, a great, tearing dilemma grew in my heart. My mother, Mama Ilara, was older now. The years of field work had stooped her back and stiffened her joints. She was no longer strong enough for a desperate run through the woods and swamps. I knew this, and the thought of leaving her behind was a physical pain, a stone in my gut. One night I tried to tell her. I tried to explain the plan, the hope of the North. She listened, her dark eyes holding mine. She didn't cry. She simply shook her head. "This is your journey, Thomas," she said, her voice firm. "My running days are over. My roots are in this ground, buried with my grandmama's bones. Your leaves must reach for the sun. I can't leave you," I whispered, the words choking me. She took my face in her hands, her palms rough but gentle. "You are not leaving me. You are carrying me. You carry my stories. You carry Samuel. You carry all of us. You get free and you tell them. You tell them what they did to us. That is how you save me. Your book, that will be my freedom." Her blessing was also a burden. She was entrusting me with our collective memory, our collective soul. My escape was no longer just for me. It was for her, for them. The journey, do Xicot ao livro, from the whip to the book, was not a solitary one. I was the vessel for countless silent voices. I had to succeed. Failure meant not only my own death, but the betrayal of everyone I was carrying with me. With my mother's blessing, the final piece of the plan was in place. The date was set, the next new moon, when the darkness would be my ally. I was ready, or so I thought. The first attempt was a catastrophe of hope. The night was perfect. A sliver of a new moon hung in the sky, offering no light to betray me. A soft rain had fallen, muffling sound and confusing the dog's sense of smell. Isaac had given the signal, a single stone on the fence post. The path was clear. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I'd said my goodbye to my mother, a silent embrace in the dark that was filled with 1,000 unspoken words. I had my pouch with the dried fish and my precious secret book. I moved through the woods, a ghost in the trees, following the familiar path I had walked in my mind 100 times. I was halfway to the Choptank River, my first major obstacle, when the night exploded. It wasn't the patrols. It was a hunting party. Master Lloyd's nephew and his friends, drunk and reckless, out for a midnight raccoon hunt, their lanterns cut through the darkness, their laughter and shouts echoing through the trees. Their dogs, not the plantation hounds, but fresh, keen-nosed hunting dogs, immediately caught my scent. Panic seized me. I ran. I abandoned the plan, the carefully mapped route, and just ran. Branches whipped at my face, thorns tore at my clothes. The baying of the dogs grew closer, a terrifying chorus of my impending doom. I scrambled up a large oak, pressing myself into the high branches, praying the rain had washed away enough of my trail. I stayed in that tree for hours, shivering and terrified as the hunting party passed below. They never saw me, but they had ruined my route, my timing. The window was closed. Defeated, I crept back to the cabin just before the first hint of dawn, my hopes in ashes. My absence had not gone unnoticed. Finch was waiting for me at the morning bell. He didn't ask where I had been. He didn't need to. The scratches on my face and the mud on my clothes were a confession. The prompt demands I treat the consequences with seriousness, not for spectacle. So I will tell you this: the whip is not just an instrument of pain. It is an instrument of humiliation. Finch did not take me to the usual whipping post. He did it in front of everyone as they were lining up for the fields. He called it an object lesson in gratitude. The pain was a white-hot fire that consumed my world. Each lash was a bolt of lightning, searing my skin, stealing my breath. But the worst part was not the pain. It was the sound. The whistle of the leather through the air, the wet, sickening thud as it met my back, and the silence from my people, not a silence of indifference, but a silence of shared agony, of helpless rage. I refused to scream. I bit my tongue until it bled, focusing on my mother's face in the crowd, her eyes shut tight. I would not give Finch the satisfaction. This defiance was the only thing I had left. The recovery was a blur of pain and fever. Mama Ilara tended to my back with poultices of comfrey and spiderwebs to staunch the bleeding, her touch gentle, her face a mask of sorrow. I lay on the dirt floor for days, unable to move, my spirit as broken as my body. The dream felt like a fool's errand. The idea of the Escravo, Escrive bestseller, slave, writes a bestseller, was a cruel joke. I was just a body, a piece of property, and they had reminded me of that in the most brutal way possible. It was Father Abraham who pulled me from the depths. He snuck into our cabin one night, a small bowl of broth in his hands. "They wrote their story on your back, Thomas," he rasped, his voice low. "Now you get up, you heal, and you write yours. You let them win, and all that pain was for nothing." His words were like cold water on a fire, not dousing it, but making it hiss and steam with renewed fury. He was right. The pain was not an ending. It was a chapter. It was fuel, the journey. Do chicote ao livro, from the whip to the book, was now written on my skin. I had to see it through. My determination returned, but it was different now. It was colder, harder. The idealistic hope was burned away, replaced by a grim resolve. I began planning again, but with a new variable: betrayal. The hunting party was bad luck. But what if it wasn't? What if someone had talked? The fear was a poison, making me second-guess everyone. I decided on a second attempt, a different route. Not through the woods, but by water. I would steal one of the small skiffs used for fishing in the creeks and paddle my way up the coast under the cover of darkness. It was riskier, more exposed, but less likely to be patrolled. The night came. I made my way to the creek, my back a tapestry of scars that pulled with every movement. The skiff was there just as I'd hoped. I was about to push off into the water when I heard a noise. I froze, melting back into the shadows of the reeds. A figure emerged from the darkness. It was Isaac, the driver. He was carrying a small bundle. My heart stopped. Had he come to stop me? To turn me in? He walked to the water's edge and looked around, his face etched with worry. He knelt and placed the bundle inside the skiff. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing back into the night. My hands trembling, I approached the boat. Inside the bundle was a thick wool blanket and a piece of oilcloth, protection against the cold and the water. There was also a small compass. Isaac hadn't betrayed me. He had helped me. He had risked everything to give me a better chance. The community, the silent network of trust, was real. They were holding the rope for me. I could not, would not let them down. But this near miss taught me a valuable lesson. The path to freedom was not just guarded by masters and overseers, but also by the unpredictable currents of loyalty and fear within our own ranks. The compass from Isaac was more than a tool. It was a testament. It renewed my faith in the invisible threads that bound us together. My alliances were my lifeline, and I began to rely on them more than ever. Esther continued to be my ears, her reports from the great house growing more detailed. She spoke of a visitor, a Quaker merchant from Delaware named Thomas Garrett. The master had railed against him for an entire dinner, calling him a criminal in saint's clothing who ran a thieves' den for runaway slaves in Wilmington. The name burned into my mind. Thomas Garrett, Wilmington. This was not just a sympathizer. This was a general in the secret war. He was a known station master on the Underground Railroad. Father Abraham confirmed it. "Garrett," he breathed, his eyes wide. "His name is whispered by free sailors up and down the bay. They say he has helped thousands. To reach him is to reach the threshold of freedom." Wilmington became my new North Star, but as my network of allies solidified, so too did the shadows of betrayal lengthen. There was a man on the plantation named Joseph. He was clever, a fast worker, and he had the trust of the overseer, Finch. Joseph was often given lighter duties, an extra ration of food. Some said he was a spy, that he traded whispers for privileges. I never believed it. I saw the same weariness in his eyes as in everyone else's. I thought his compliance was a mask for survival, just like my silence. I was wrong. My plan now involved a 2-day journey on foot, sticking to the swampy, less-traveled eastern border of the county, aiming for the headwaters of the Choptank River where I could cross more easily into Delaware. It was a brutal path, but one Isaac confirmed was rarely patrolled. Only a few people knew of this new plan: my mother, Father Abraham, Isaac, and Esther. One evening, I was in the woods, checking a hiding spot where Esther had left me a small parcel of food, when I overheard voices. It was Finch and Joseph. I pressed myself flat against the damp earth, my heart pounding. "Told you he was planning something again," Joseph was saying, his voice slick and eager. "He's been watching the swamps to the east, thinks no one goes there." Finch grunted. "The east? Nothing but marsh and snakes. Good, let him get a day out. Let him think he's clever. We'll pick him up in the Blackwater swamp. Make an example of him far from the others. No one will even know what happened." A cold dread washed over me. Joseph had betrayed me. He had traded my life for a pat on the head and a few extra scraps from the master's table. It wasn't just the betrayal that hurt. It was the naivety I had shown. I had wanted to believe in the solidarity of our suffering, but I had forgotten that fear is its own kind of master, and some will do anything to serve it. The dream of the escravo, escrive bestseller. Slave writes a bestseller felt hollow if I couldn't even read the people standing next to me. I crept away, my mind racing. They were expecting me to go east. They had laid a trap. My carefully constructed plan was now a death sentence. I went to Father Abraham, my trust shattered. I told him what I'd heard. His face, usually a mask of stoic strength, sagged with sorrow. "Fear makes cowards of good men, Thomas," he said quietly. "And it makes monsters of cowards. We cannot trust that plan now. We cannot trust anyone but the 4 of us." We had to create a new plan, a final plan, in less than a week. It had to be daring, unexpected. It had to be the opposite of what they were expecting. The new plan was born of desperation and genius. Isaac was scheduled to take a wagon of wheat to a mill near the town of Easton, on the other side of the county, to the west, the opposite direction of the trap. The journey would take him 2 days. He would be traveling on the main road in plain sight. It was the last place they would look for a fugitive. "I can build a false bottom in the wagon," Father Abraham whispered, his eyes gleaming with the fire of his forge. "A space just big enough for one man. It'll be hell in there, but it'll get you past the patrols." The final days were a blur of frantic, secret activity. Father Abraham worked through the night, his hammering and sawing disguised as routine repairs. He constructed a shallow compartment beneath the main bed of the wagon, accessible through a hidden panel. It was a coffin of hope. The test of trust was absolute. My life would be in Isaac's hands. One wrong word, one nervous glance from him, and we would both be doomed. I looked at him the night before the journey, searching his face for any sign of doubt. "They wrote on your back, Thomas," he said, his voice tight with emotion, echoing Father Abraham's words. "They've been writing on mine my whole life, just with a different kind of whip. This is how I write back." The most painful part was the final goodbye. There would be no dramatic escape into the woods this time. I would simply disappear. The night before Isaac was to leave, I went to my mother. We didn't say much. We held each other in the dark of the cabin, the silence thick with love and fear. She pressed a small, smooth stone into my hand. "This is from the soil of this place," she whispered. "So you never forget where you came from, and you never have to come back." She knew, as I did, that we would likely never see each other again. This was the price of freedom. A price paid in shattered families and broken hearts. This was the story I had to tell. The journey, du chicote au livre, from the whip to the book, was paved with such impossible choices. I was leaving my entire world behind to save a small piece of my soul. I could only pray it would be worth the cost. The next morning, before the sun rose, I slipped out of the cabin and made my way to the waiting wagon to be sealed into darkness. The world shrank to a box of rough-sawn planks, smelling of hay and horse sweat and my own sharp fear. Lying flat on my back in the false bottom of the wagon, I could hear everything, magnified and terrifying. The crunch of Isaac's boots on the gravel, the jingle of the harness, his low, steady voice calming the horses. Then the lurch of the wagon as it began to move. The great escape had begun, not with a run, but with an agonizingly slow crawl. Every bump in the road was a jolt that shot pain through my scarred back. Every stop was a fresh wave of terror. Was it a patrol? Had someone discovered us? I could hear the muffled sounds of the world outside, a dog barking, the distant shout of a farmer, the rumble of another wagon passing. I was a ghost at my own funeral, listening to the world go on without me. The first test came an hour into the journey. I heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching, fast. The wagon slowed and stopped. "Morning, Isaac," a voice drawled. It was Finch. My blood ran cold. He must have grown suspicious. The trap in the swamp had been empty, and now he was checking the only other way out. "Morning, Mr. Finch." Isaac's voice was a miracle of calm. I could hear the forced deference in it, an accent he put on like a coat. "Just taking this wheat to the mill in Easton. Master's orders." "Heard you had some trouble with runaways lately," Finch said, his voice laced with suspicion. I could picture him, sitting high on his horse, his cold eyes scanning the wagon. "You see anything unusual this morning? Anyone on the road who shouldn't be?" I held my breath, my body rigid. This was it. My life hung on Isaac's next words. "No, sir," Isaac said, and the lie was as smooth as glass. "Nothing but squirrels and crows. Roads are quiet today." There was a long, terrible silence. I could hear the creak of Finch's saddle leather as he shifted his weight. I imagined him staring at the wagon, at the very planks that separated me from his sight. He was a wolf sniffing at a rabbit hole. "See that you get a good price for that wheat," Finch finally said, his tone dismissive, "and don't take all day about it." "Yes, sir, Mr. Finch." The hoofbeats faded into the distance. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding, my body trembling with relief. Isaac had held. He had not broken. He was my brother in this fight, and he was magnificent. The rest of the day was a long, dark, suffocating eternity. The heat built up in my small prison, and the air grew stale. I focused on the rhythm of the wheels, on the words from my secret book, reciting them in my head to keep the panic at bay. This confinement, this darkness, it was the price. The journey, do chicote ao livro, from the whip to the book, required me to become a word on a hidden page, waiting to be read. That night, Isaac pulled the wagon into a thicket of trees off the main road. The panel slid open, and the rush of cool night air was the sweetest thing I had ever felt. I scrambled out, my limbs cramped and weak. Isaac handed me a piece of bread and a canteen of water. We didn't speak. We were partners in a crime so great that words felt inadequate. The second day was even worse. We were closer to Delaware, closer to the zone where patrols were more frequent and slave catchers more vigilant. Twice, we were stopped by patrols. Each time, Isaac's calm demeanor and the official-looking papers for the wheat were enough. He was a brilliant actor. His performance was the reason I was still alive. The climax of the escape came as we neared the border. We had to cross a bridge over a small river, a known checkpoint. As we approached, Isaac suddenly pulled the wagon to a halt. Up ahead, silhouetted against the setting sun, were 3 armed men, a patrol, and they were checking every wagon. "They're searching everything," Isaac whispered through a crack in the floorboards. "They'll find the compartment." There was no time to think. "Keep going," I hissed back. "Don't stop. I have to get out." Isaac hesitated for only a second, then clicked the reins. As the wagon rumbled toward the bridge, I found the emergency release Father Abraham had built, a single pin that would allow a section of the floor to drop away. This was a one-way ticket. Once I was out, There was no going back. Just before we reached the bridge, as the wagon rounded a sharp bend with a steep, wooded embankment, I pulled the pin. The plank fell away. I rolled out of the moving wagon, hitting the ground hard and tumbling down the embankment into the thick undergrowth. I lay there, bruised and breathless, as the wagon continued onto the bridge without so much as a stutter in its rhythm. I watched from the shadows as the patrol stopped Isaac. They prodded the sacks of wheat with their rifles. They looked under the wagon, but Isaac, bless his soul, had already started complaining about a loose wheel, drawing their attention, performing his role to perfection. They found nothing. They waved him on. He had done it. He had gotten me across. But I was not safe. As I watched Isaac disappear over the bridge, I heard a shout from behind me. One of the patrollers, lagging behind the others, had seen the flash of movement from the corner of his eye. "Someone there! In the woods!" The chase was on. I scrambled to my feet and plunged into the forest, the shouts and the baying of dogs erupting behind me. This was the run I had been dreading and preparing for my entire life. I was no longer a hidden passenger. I was the hunted. My knowledge of the land, my strength, my will— it was all that stood between me and a return to a hell worse than any I had yet known. Freedom was a matter of yards, a matter of seconds. I ran, my mother's stone clutched in my hand, my secret book a dead weight against my chest, a testament they would never, ever read. The idea that Entrania Scravo escrive bestseller, slave writes a bestseller, was a defiant scream in my mind as I ran for my life. The forest became a blur of green and brown, a suffocating maze. The shouts of the patrollers and the relentless baying of their dogs were a soundtrack to my terror. But this time, panic was not my master. The failed first attempt, the scars on my back, the cold determination forged in betrayal, they had prepared me for this. I was no longer just running from something, I was running to something. I ran toward the water. I remembered Father Abraham's stories of fugitives throwing dogs off their scent by running through streams. I plunged into a shallow, fast-moving creek, the icy water a shock to my system, and ran upstream for a quarter of a mile, the stones slick and treacherous under my feet. I hauled myself out on the far bank, gasping for air, and listened. The sound of the dogs was fainter now, confused. I had bought myself time. For 2 days I moved only at night, navigating by the North Star, the constant, silent promise in the sky. During the day, I would find the thickest brush or a hollow log and crawl inside, forcing my body into a state of near hibernation, my senses on high alert. I ate the last of my dried fish, and then nothing, the hunger a dull ache that I learned to ignore. On the 3rd night, I stumbled out of the woods and saw it. A single lantern hanging on a fence post next to a simple, unpainted farmhouse, and next to it, a quilt hanging on a clothesline, a quilt with a blue square in the center. It was a signal I had read about in the abolitionist papers, a safe house, a station on the Underground Railroad. My heart hammered against my ribs, but this time with a frantic, desperate hope. I approached the house, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. I knocked on the back door, a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet night. The door opened a crack. A woman with a severe face and kind eyes, dressed in the simple grey dress of the Quakers, looked out at me. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice low but not unkind. I swallowed, my throat dry as dust. I gave the code, the words Father Abraham had taught me. "I am a friend of a friend." The woman's face softened. She opened the door wider. "A friend is always welcome here," she said. "Come in, quickly." I stepped over the threshold, and for the first time in my life, I was inside a white person's house not as a servant, but as a guest. The woman's name was Hannah, and her husband was Jedediah. They fed me a bowl of hot stew that tasted like heaven itself. They didn't ask my name or my story. They simply saw a man in need and offered him sanctuary. They hid me in a small, secret room behind the fireplace, and for the first time in days, I slept a true, dreamless sleep. My journey north was a chain of such moments, a series of leaps of faith into the arms of strangers. From Hannah and Jedediah's farm, I was taken by a free black farmer in the back of his wagon, hidden under a pile of potato sacks, to the next station. There I was hidden in a church belfry for a day before being passed on to a boatman who smuggled me across the Delaware River at night. Each station was different, each conductor a profile in courage. There were Quakers who believed slavery was a sin against God. There were free blacks who risked their own precarious freedom to help their brethren. There were even some white farmers and merchants who, for reasons of their own, hated the slave-holding aristocracy and did what they could to undermine it. The dangers were ever present. I saw posters with my description nailed to trees, offering a reward for my capture. The words "runaway slave" were a brand I still wore. I learned to live with the constant gnawing fear of the slave catcher, the bounty hunter whose only morality was money. After nearly 2 weeks of this harrowing journey, I finally arrived in Philadelphia. I stepped off a ferry onto the bustling docks, and the world tilted on its axis. I saw black men and women walking the streets with their heads held high. They were not owned. They were dock workers, artisans, shopkeepers. They were free. I stood on a street corner, a stranger in a strange land, and I began to weep. Tears of grief for all I had lost, and tears of a joy so profound it was painful. The journey do chicote ao livro, from the whip to the book, had brought me to this new, bewildering world. But my first taste of freedom was quickly soured by a new reality. Freedom in the North was not the paradise I had imagined. It was a different kind of cage. I was free from the whip, but not from the color of my skin. I saw the signs, no blacks or dogs allowed. I was jostled off sidewalks by white people who looked at me with contempt. I was paid less for the same work as a white man. The racism was not as violent as the South, but it was a constant, grinding presence, a reminder that even in the land of the free, I was not seen as an equal. My dream of the Escravo Escrive bestseller, Slave Writes a Bestseller, now had a new, more complicated chapter to add: the hypocrisy of the North. Freedom wasn't a destination. It was not a place you arrived at, but a battle you had to keep fighting every single day. I had escaped the plantation, but I had not yet escaped America. The fight was far from over. Philadelphia in 1849 was a city of contradictions, a cacophony of liberty and prejudice. I found work on the docks, my muscles honed by years of field labor, making me a valuable hand. The pay was a pittance, but it was mine. The feeling of receiving wages for my own sweat, of holding coins in my hand that no master could take from me, was a profound and deeply moving experience. I found a small room in a boarding house run by a black woman, a hub for the newly arrived and the politically active. It was there that I finally unpacked my most precious possession, my secret book. The small, leather-bound collection of stitched-together pages was stained with sweat and dirt, its edges worn from the journey, but it was intact. As I read my own crude handwriting, the memories flooded back. Samuel being sold, Sarah's cries, my mother's face in the firelight, the searing pain of Finch's whip, Isaac's calm voice in the face of death. This was not just a book. It was a relic. It was proof. I began to write again, but now with real ink and paper bought with my own wages. I expanded on my notes, pouring all the pain, the rage, and the moments of grace onto the page. I wrote through the nights, the story pouring out of me like a river breaking a dam. I was determined that my personal story of escape would become a testament to the millions still in bondage. The fantastical dream of an Escravo Escrive bestseller, A Slave Writes a Bestseller, was becoming my life's singular mission. Through the network at the boarding house, I was introduced to members of the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society. I was hesitant at first, wary of white people and their motives, but I met men and women, like the famous abolitionist William Still, a black man who was a primary conductor on the Underground Railroad in Philadelphia. He listened to my story, His eyes filled with a solemn understanding. He read a few pages of my manuscript. "This," he said, his voice ringing with conviction, "this is a weapon. This is the truth they try so hard to bury. The world needs to read this." With his help, excerpts of my narrative were first published in abolitionist newspapers like The Liberator. I wrote under a pseudonym, a graduate from the peculiar institution, to protect myself and those I had left behind. The response was immediate and powerful. My raw, first-hand account of the daily horrors and the quiet humanity of the enslaved cut through the political rhetoric. People who had seen slavery as a distant, abstract problem were forced to confront its brutal, personal reality. The journey, do chicote ao livro, from the whip to the book, had found its audience. In 1852, my full narrative was published as a book, The Bell and the Star. It was not a bestseller in the way we think of it today, but in the abolitionist circles of the North and in Europe, it was a phenomenon. It was read in churches, debated in meeting halls, and cited on the floor of Congress. It became a powerful piece of propaganda in the moral war against slavery, one of the many slave narratives that chipped away at the foundation of that monstrous institution. My life had transformed. I was no longer Thomas the laborer. I was an author, a speaker. I traveled throughout the North, standing before crowds of white faces, and I told my story. I told them about my mother. I told them about Samuel. I told them about the quiet dignity and the fierce resistance of my people. It was terrifying, but I found a power in my voice that I never knew I possessed. But my greatest work was done in secret. With the money I earned from my book and speaking engagements, I became a funder for the Underground Railroad. I worked with William Still and others, using my knowledge of the routes and my own hard-won experience to help guide other fugitives. Every time I met a new arrival, a family huddled together, a lone man with haunted eyes, I saw myself. I saw my mother. Helping them was the only true way to repay the debt I owed to Isaac, to Father Abraham, to Hannah and Jedediah, and to all the others who had lit my path. I never saw my mother again. I received word years later, through the intricate grapevine of the railroad, that she had passed away peacefully in her sleep. In the letter, the writer told me she had heard of my book, and she had died proud. That knowledge was a bittersweet comfort, a wound that would never fully heal, but one I learned to carry with me. My life was a testament to the power of a single defiant act, the decision to learn. From tracing a letter in charcoal on a wall, I had found a way to write my own destiny and to help shape the destiny of my nation. My story, and the thousands of stories like it, became part of the great chorus demanding freedom. A chorus that would eventually swell into the thunder of the Civil War. My legacy is not in the pages of a single book. It is in the resilience of a people who, in the face of unimaginable cruelty, held on to their humanity. They preserved their culture in song. They fought back in 1,000 small and large ways, and they charted their own paths to freedom by a star in the sky. Their stories are woven into the fabric of this country. So I ask you, look into your own history. Uncover the stories of resistance in your family, in your community. Every story shared is a light against the darkness. Every voice raised is a continuation of the fight for true liberty and justice for all. Share them, honor them. For in these stories of resistance we find the truest definition of what it means to be free.